Hello.
Hi.
I'll just give it a couple of minutes for people to join, and then I'll get started with the introductions.
Sure. Sounds great.
I'll just give it a couple of minutes for people to join. Okay, I think we can start. Hi, everyone. Whether you're here or joining later, welcome to this event with Champaca Bookstore with Sanjena Sathian about her new book, Goddess Complex. I'm just going to introduce Sanjana and her book to you, as well as a little bit about Champaka. If at any point anyone has any questions, you can put them in the YouTube chat box, and we'll get to them at the end of the conversation. And if you want to purchase either of Sanjana's books, there's a link in the description, which leads to our website, which ships across India. I'm Nirika. I work at Champaka. Champaka is an independent bookstore and children's library. We bring diverse stories and perspectives for our readers through our books and events. We are located in Bangalore in India. We have 2 stores now in Vasant Nagar and Indranagar, and a website that ships across the country. A little bit about Sanjana. Sanjana is a writer and essayist who lives in Hong Kong. She's the author of Goddess Complex and Gold Diggers. Her short fiction appears in the Best American Short Stories, The Atlantic, Conjunctions, One Story, and more. She also writes for screen and has bylines in the New York Times, the Yale Review, and the New Yorker, among others. She's an alumna of the Iowa Writers Workshop and has taught fiction at Emory University, Mercer University, the University of Iowa, and Victoria University. Today, we're going to be talking about Goddess Complex. I'll tell you a little bit about the book. So it's about Sanjana, a character called Sanjana, but Sanjana with an E, who's an anthropologist. And we meet her at a sort of crossroads in her life. A year ago, she left her husband, a struggling actor named Killian, in Goa after a disagreement about whether or not to have children. But now, a year later, Sanjana begins receiving mysterious messages from people she used to know and strangers alike, congratulating her on her pregnancy, only she isn't pregnant. When Sanjana decides to get to the bottom of this and to finally track Killian down and get a divorce, which is a journey that brings her back to India, she comes face to face with another Sanjana, this time spelled with an E, an unnerving mirror into what she could have been if her life had taken a different direction. Goddess Complex is sharp, it's incisive, it's funny. It's about femininity, fertility, motherhood, influencers, optimization cults, the choices we make and the choices we're forced into. And we are so delighted to have Sanjana here today. Thank you
Thanks
for
for having
joining us.
us. Yeah. Thank you. And I'm really
I
excited
thought,
to do it with such a special bookstore. I wish we were doing it in person because Bangalore is very dear to my heart. But thank you all for having me.
oh, that's so nice to hear. Yeah, maybe one day. I think a lot of people saw the event poster and thought it would be in person, but maybe someday.
See you guys soon.
So to start off, I thought we'd start with what the book literally starts with, which is the epigraph, which I was immediately caught by. The first epigraph is from Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, and there is a part 2 where the epigraph is from Dostoevsky's The Double. So I was wondering if you want to talk about how those books connect to Goddess Complex and the ideas you're exploring.
Yeah. Well, those 2 novels, they're both about doubles. One is called The Double. So they're kind of really important novels in the Doppelganger tradition. I would say those 2 and Operation Shylock by Philip Roth are sort of like 3 guiding stars that helped me craft this particular double story. The original version of Goddess Complex was actually much more Rebecca infused. I actually started by kind of writing this novel about a character named Sanjana, who is like an expat in Bombay, as I have been, and who was dating a man and then kind of discovered that there was something off about his past, which is like the plot of Rebecca. And I found that, Rebecca is just this, like, it's this classic, crucial, like, Gothic novel that is about what it is like to discover that you don't know your partner, and particularly what it is like to be a woman who does not know a man. And it's so of its time, like it's about women. It's from the 30s, and it's about specifically like women not understanding what happened to their husbands in the First World War. And so that there was something about that. I love the book so dearly, but too much of it made its way into early drafts. And so I ended up thinking like, I got to take a few steps back. I ended up kind of, if I wrote too much that was just straightforwardly Rebecca, it was turning into a really kind of like flat Me Too sort of story. And I've written criticism about just how difficult it is to get that kind of storytelling right, because as crucial as it is for like us as women to figure out like something is wrong, it's actually not like, it doesn't often meet like the needs of a narrative to have someone else just discover, oh, surprise, the shitty man is a shitty man. So that version of the novel led me to a little bit of a dead end, but I started thinking a lot more about like loosely about the concept of the double and what makes the double interesting to me. And what was interesting to me about writing a doppelganger story is that it's about not fully knowing yourself, right? The reason Freud says that we're all obsessed with doubles or we're terrified of meeting our double is obviously it's just terrifying to imagine that there is another version of you out there, partly because it threatens your own sense of self. Like, am I really me if there could be another me? But I think I would add to that, there's like a desire there, right? Like, what if I were another person? What if I were better off as the other me? So when I was thinking about the kind of the theme of doubles and femininity, the most obvious place it led me was, you know, I was in my early 30s. I had like just turned 30 at this point in the writing. And everyone around me was thinking and talking about having children. So that was where sort of that double arc led me. The Dostoevsky epigraph is also important, but I think kind of in a slightly different way. The Double by Dostoevsky is this really important doppelganger story, and it's just so bonkers. Like, it's about a man named Golyadkin who meets another man named Golyadkin, and Golyadkin Jr. comes to town and starts trying to displace Golyadkin Sr. And it's like, it's really funny, but it ends in sort of the classic way the doppelganger stories do, where like the first guy is like shipped off to the asylum because he's everyone has decided that he's lost his mind. But the thing that the line I take from that I think is like the most serious line and what is actually quite a comic story is he just realizes at some point that he does not want to be himself anymore. But it's partly because there's this other person who has showed up and threatened him. So those two were just really important sort of like texts, and they gave me those epigraphs.
So on the topic of doubling, this is kind of the most obvious next question, I think, which is the doubling or actually tripling of your name, which is you've given your protagonist your name spelled differently, her surname is slightly different, but at a certain point in the narrative, we do meet her doppelganger who shares your exact name, which is such a fun choice. It was so fun to read. And why did you do that? What was that choice like?
I mean, as I said, the earliest versions of this novel, even in like 2017, 2018, when I first started working on this, I was always playing with my own name. And some of that I think had to do with, I was trying to write something that felt really, really close to me. And I wanted to play with that, right? Like, this was, the 2010s gave us autofiction, but autofiction is a genre that like predates the 2010s and dates to the 70s, and Marguerite Duras traced back even earlier to the Japanese I novel. This is like a game that authors and writers and artists have played forever. The cover of this is by an artist named Laura Berger, who, but I also thought often of like the Frida Kahlo, the Two Fridas painting when I was working on this. And like, that's another artist who played all the time with like doubling and tripling herself. So I say this in part to just be like, I'm not the only crazy person who's done this, because this is a really silly kind of crazy move to make. But the reason I think I wanted to make it, and the reason that I think a lot of these other kinds of writers have wanted to make it, from Borges to Roth to Chris Kraus, is when you involve your own name, you are automatically playing with a reality outside of the book. That's what makes metafiction fun. That's why Operation Shylock is a metafictional novel. And I think it asks the reader to assume an extra level of intimacy, even beyond what the first person, the use of the first person can provide. And then by asking for that extra level of intimacy, like someone might really feel like they're in my brain and, check the front of the cover, see how close this is. I understand there's some game you're playing. For some writers, that is the game enough. Like that is the game of autofiction. It's like, I'm going to bring you as close as possible to my reality. And you're just kind of going to wonder. Because I'm a writer who really enjoys artifice and plot and twists and genre, that was never going to be quite enough for me. So I always knew, I think once the book got off the ground, I knew that I was going to create that intimacy in part of the novel. And then I was going to have a lot of fun subverting it. Like something that because you've finished the book now, is that if anyone actually calls this book autofiction, by the end, that like they haven't finished it, because no one thinks that this has happened to me. So for me, I think it's really fun to sort of bob and weave between the intimacy of something that almost looks like autofiction and then the like total zaniness and like embrace of plot and artifice that comes from taking a surprising turn in the second half.
Yeah, it is fun that the protagonist whose mind we're in, that's her point of view, doesn't have your name. It's the other one that has your name. So there is that kind of like distancing. Oh, it's a very playful novel. So it works on so many levels. So another book that I thought about a lot when I was reading Goddess Complex is Doppelganger by Naomi Klein, obviously for the title. It is also, I think, where I first heard of Operation Shylock, now that you mention it. I think she talks a lot about it. So there's obviously the connection with the title, but there's also there's a lot of similar ideas, I think, that you're both exploring. This kind of rise in wellness culture. There's the kind of like impact. I was going to say the influence of influencers. But also this like particular political moment that intersects with a particular technological moment. And something that I mentioned this to you earlier, but something that is really interesting to me about Goddess Complex is the time in which it's set, which is in 2018, where you mentioned you started writing it. But it is also like in my head, it is the like meteoric rise of TikTok. But it is also like a specific political moment and a specific moment of the internet in general. So I was wondering what made you choose that time?
Yeah. Well, the material reason is that it starts in 2018 because that's when I started it. But I kept that as the starting date as I kept writing forward, in part because, well, on a material level, the novel is partly about, it's not only about abortion, but there's an abortion that is referenced pretty early in like the first few pages of the novel. And that means that it was going to be set before the Dobbs leak, or before the Dobbs decision in 2022, which overturned Roe v. Wade and revoked people's rights to choose. And that felt important because even though what I'm writing now has taken on, I think, like a little bit of a new like political timeliness, the world I'm writing about is a world where people have access to choice. And I think there are moments in the novel that are like there's a moment early on in the novel where Sanjena feels awkward about sharing her abortion with her friend who is pregnant and who has just announced that she is pregnant. I think potentially if you talked about that right now, there would be like a new heroism to being like, oh, like you, thank God, like your choice and my choice, they're very interdependent. Like, of course you can talk about your abortion. I think at a time when we like took abortion rights a little bit more for granted in the US, there was a genuine awkwardness about like how to, and I think there still is, like there is awkwardness around choice. And it was important to me to write at a time where like the stakes were slightly lower and the stakes were social, like the way they are in like a novel of manners. So that's part of the sort of timestamp of it. It was also always going to feel pre-TikTok because I have never opened TikTok. So I vaguely understand what it is through other people, but my brain has not been fried by TikTok, only by Instagram, which is obviously better. The Naomi Klein book is super interesting though, and I'm glad you bring it up. It is, so for people who haven't read it, Naomi Klein is like a famous leftist activist. And Naomi Wolf is her doppelganger, and like down to like creepy thing, like even in my head, like I have to be like, it's Klein, right? Yes, it's Klein, not Wolf. Naomi Wolf, they have like the same, their husbands have the same name, but Naomi Wolf was like a feminist who wrote The Beauty Myth, and then who kind of has now become like an anti-vaxxer, and like their interests overlapped briefly around Occupy, but like basically Naomi Klein, like solid Gen X leftist, we stand, and then Naomi Wolf has just lost her mind and represents like kind of everything that is absurd about the right-wing internet. The reason that book is so wonderful, though, is because it's partly about that dance of the Naomis, but Klein then like points out that we all have these sort of doppelgangers, and writes about the internet as this like mirror world place. And I thought a lot about that book, not while I was writing this one, because it only came out 2 years ago, but when I was writing an op-ed about Usha Vance, who I'm kind of obsessed with. She is not that much older than me. My mother's name is Usha. Her dad's name is Krish. My dad's name is Krish. Like, we both come from like exactly the same kind of like elite South Indian American stock. We were at Yale at the same time. I'm like not that many degrees separated from her husband. Like we probably passed each other in New Haven at some point. And more importantly, like she existed in the milieu that I existed in for a long time. And I think there are a lot of Indian Americans who look at her and are like, how did you end up there? And I think there's like that's sort of a sickening feeling. It should make us all sick, particularly in America, because it just suggests that like identity is slippery. It's exactly what's scary about doppelgangers, right? Like Freud says, the thing that is terrifying is the thing that is inside you. The thing that is terrifying to me about Usha Vance is I wonder if I had wound up with a conservative man and just stayed and stayed and stayed, or someone who presented himself as centrist. And if I had just stayed and stayed and stayed, could I now be second lady and, handling the children at mass? I have no idea, but that's a chilling idea. And the Klein book is great for that.
Oh, that's so interesting. I guess there are a lot more connections between your book and her book than I thought, actually, because all of this also comes to play in Goddess Complex. But something I think that's generally really funny about books, contemporary books, is that it's so easy for a book to be off its time just in like 2 years. Like, if it's set 2 years ago, there's already just like there's a way you can tell, which I find fascinating. It's kind of like a period novel from 5 years ago.
Totally.
Okay, let's shift to craft a little bit. Something that I think is true of both your books is that your protagonists, and they're both first person point of view, is that your protagonists are really interesting and complex. And as a reader, I often disagreed with them, which I really enjoy because it makes them feel really real. And it also is a skill for them to be disagreeable, but also compelling. But I was wondering what it takes for you to craft a character, and especially with Sanjena, where that started and how it grew.
Yeah, I mean, I know what you mean, and it's funny because I just think that's the definition of what first person narration is supposed to do. But not everyone agrees with me. So I think that I read a lot of first person stories from students, for instance, where people are really protective of their first person narrators. They're like, first of all, this person, everyone's going to think it's me. And also, I like them, right? Like, I have put all of this effort into imagining this person and representing their consciousness on the page. And if they do something that is like morally objectionable, or if they say the wrong thing, or if they behave in a way that unravels like the social fabric around them, like, that threatens me, and it threatens my ability to sort of defend them as like righteous consciousnesses that I invented. I think that that's a waste of fiction. I think that's a waste of the power of fiction. I think that the entire purpose of first-person narration in particular is to live in unreliability. And so it's really important to me that my characters do the wrong thing. And I mean, like, I think when we look around, like a comp that I thought of a lot with my first book, their narrator is like a 15-year-old boy who's sort of often badly behaved in the first part of the novel. It's very Holden Caulfield. I remember reading The Catcher in the Rye in high school and being like, I hate this guy. But that voice, the voice lived in my head for decades, you know, because it is the voice of an alive person who is making mistakes and reckoning. In this novel, I think I thought a lot about like Esther Greenwood in The Bell Jar. I thought a lot about Fleabag. I thought a lot about the narrator of Norman Rush's 1991 novel Mating. I thought about how difficult it is to be agreeable as a woman in certain situations. And in this case, someone who is starting to feel unstable because you described the plot of the novel at the top of our event. She has had an abortion, but there are these weird mix-ups happening and people think she's pregnant, and that creates an unstable sense of self. So of course her behavior is then going to be unstable. Yeah, when I read student work, when I write book reviews, like a thing that I'm often on the lookout for is whether or not I think a writer is trying to kind of defend themselves through their character, or whether or not they're willing to let their character loose in the world, because only then can we kind of test the ideas that the character is carrying, right? Like I have given Sanjena a bunch of ideas that I like agree with. Like she and I share a frustration with the pronatalist organization of the world. But if I just give her those sets of ideas and allow her to move cleanly through the world, then I've written a polemic. If I give her some of those ideas and make her like a deeply flawed vessel for those, then A, it's funny. And B, it allows me and hopefully the reader to see how the ideas that when I'm up on my perch thinking, I've got it all right, like I can then see what those actually look like when they play out in the world. And we can see all of the ways in which ideologies are sort of like not sufficient explanations for what it is to be a person. And that's exciting, like human territory for me.
Oh, that's so interesting. The idea of like writing or like fiction as this kind of like experimentation ground. That's such a cool thought. Yeah, I do think that there is this kind of maybe not, I don't have it from the student writer perspective, but I do see it sometimes with readers, which is this kind of like morality being applied to a character. And then by extension, it's author, which kind of never has made sense to me.
I mean, I think some of that comes down to we do read more first person writing these days. And so it's easier, I think, to make the jump, the conflation. But also, like, I've been thinking about and reading a lot of like third person omniscient and multi-POV novels recently. That those are the kinds of novels that I grew up on. I just happen to have written two that are in first person. But like the social novel as a form, when you have multiple POVs and you have multiple characters bumping up against one another, it's much easier to see, oh, of course the narrator, of course the author wants us to see how she's wrong and he's wrong and they're all wrong. But it's harder to see that sometimes in a first person novel. So I am sympathetic to where readers get that from, but I think an author operating in good faith is doing the same thing, whether they're using first or third person. They're always putting ideas in the mouths of characters that are like not correct ideas or not fully correct ideas, and the characters should always be like liable to fuck them up.
That's true, yeah. Something I thought was really fun in your book, staying on the kind of like theme of your book being really fun, is there is this kind of stereotype of white people, white Americans coming to India to find themselves. And in your book, there is this really funny thing happening where Sanjena is doing that on this extremely literal level, because she's come to India and she's literally found her doppelganger. But I do think that kind of like idea of like other the understanding of what it means to write about India in this, because there's also this kind of like wellness culture thread through your book, or like, there are these ideas of what India is, or is how it's talked about. And I was wondering what it was like for you to kind of navigate that as you were writing.
Yeah, there's Sanjena, and then there's also like her husband Killian, who believes that he is half Indian, and like goes to try and find himself and make his way in Bollywood, but he's very white, and keeps getting cast as the British baddie. So there's a few people who follow the pattern that you're describing. I mean, I think it's interesting because I made that choice. I moved to India twice, having never lived there, being like, laughed at as the ABCD who like really can't speak an Indian language. I made my attempts, but I'm still not great. And it was like an incredibly meaningful experience to me. Like I have so much love for Bombay, for the other places I spent time, Bangalore, Calcutta, Chennai. But I think there's sort of like an ode to like the experience of being on the train in Bombay. There's like little sort of like moments in the book where I do write about that, but it's very, very easy for immigrants, whether we're talking like NRIs or second generation, to romanticize and like nostalgicize the motherland. And that is a move that I think existed in a prior generation of immigrant literature, and I have never found it interesting. And in fact, I find it a sort of dishonest way of talking about a place, because a place is not a fixed thing. One of the first interviews when I moved to India in 2015, 2016, I was a journalist. And one of the first interviews I did was with T.M. Krishna, the Carnatic musician, who he came in really hot. He was like, I know all about your kind, like you second gen, you NRIs, like you all think that India is the India of the 1970s because that's when your parents left it. And he just like, I had like not asked a question. This was like the first interaction I had, but he was right. That is what it's like to live. And that's kind of the subject of my first novel, is in many ways like the kind of flattening of an entire civilization and country and society, and therefore identity. And like, it's like disrespectful to India, but it's also like disrespectful to me as a person who has an interest in like the place that my parents left behind, to say that it was one thing and then I always must like pay allegiance to that one thing that exists in their memories, is like a really restricting and like inauthentic way of existing. So when I sent Sanjena on this little journey back to the motherland, I didn't think of it exactly the way you're talking about it, but I was really thinking about like a lot of the worlds that I went to as like a kind of reverse migrating millennial, which included like Oroville and, the Osho ashram in Pune. Like I bopped around all of these places and I had a sense of humor about it. And I was also like really into learning different forms of meditation. And I think again, just sort of thinking about duality and thinking about how fiction is like our job as novelists is to sort of empathize with and also laugh at the emotional impulse. I think that's kind of what I was playing with. And so hopefully people will enjoy the sections, particularly there's several extended ones set at sort of like wellnessy places. They're also they're weird. They're like enclosed settings. Like one section is sort of comic, the other is sort of gothic. And I've gotten both of those experiences at those places. Like if a kind of wellness compound if everything's going well and the sun is out, it's like weird at best. If it's a little darker, it's not going so well, you're like, get me out of here. And then it becomes a horror movie. Like it's a really, really thin line there.
Oh, that's so interesting. I think when I first read the book, I just read it in one go, but then I was thinking about it, and yeah, those like later scenes really feel so gothic. They're kind of like set in a house. It was so much fun to think about, especially with the context of Rebecca as the epigraph. Yeah. But I do actually want to ask about the gothic, just generally actually genre. You mentioned that you're really interested with like playing with genre. And Gold Diggers had this element of magic realism. I'm so sorry, I'm going to pause here. mid-question and be like, if anyone has any questions, can you add them in the comments? And we'll get to them right after this one. Yeah, okay. So Gold Diggers had this element of magic realism, and here you're leaning into this kind of like thriller, gothic space. And another thing that I found really fun is that there are also multiple references to horror tropes. I think there's a mention of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. There are multiple references to kind of the pregnancy horror movie, Rosemary's Baby. There's one description of birth that felt exactly like the chestburster scene in Alien, which I thought was so fun. And in case anyone is worried about the book, it's not a horror novel. It is kind of like playing with a lot of these things. I thought it was so interesting that it had all these kind of touch points through the book. And I was wondering what it was like for you to kind of lean in or to play with genre in this book, especially compared to your first book.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, genre is like one of many tools available to play with anytime I'm approaching a new piece. Often it is like one of the most fun, so I end up messing with it a lot. Like as you said, the first novel is magic realist. This one, the word I often use is like it sits in the register of the uncanny. I mean, like one of my theses, like about the way fiction works, and I like teach a class that's sort of about this, is just this idea that like realism and non-realism are actually not that far away from each other. They're both playing very similar games. And when I talk to my students about this, I often talk about the Russian formalist Victor Shklovsky, who talks about the technique of estrangement, to sort of ask the reader to look very closely at something, and the writer needs to describe it in such a way that the familiar feels strange. And the writer that Shklovsky uses, who says like does estrangement better than anyone on the line level, is Tolstoy, a realist. But that estrangement is also something that like Shirley Jackson does, that Stephen King does. Like the thing that makes horror scary is the setting that is familiar. So I kind of like backed my way into horror because I started in the uncanny. I am not like a horror head. I really like 70s and like 80s horror from like before it was scary. I watched a lot of Hitchcock when I was writing this. There's like a reference to The Wicker Man, Rosemary's Baby, obviously, but like Rosemary's Baby is adapted from actually a comic novel. Like the movie is a horror movie. And it's a great movie. Unfortunately, Roman Polanski directed. It's a great movie. But the book is a satire. It's actually like a satire of motherhood. And so I have actually a little more in common with the book version of Rosemary's Baby than the film. But yeah, I think that I found my way into horror accidentally and then was like, oh, this is the right sort of like mood board for the novel. And I think I got lucky in the sense that I think more people understand how closely related comedy and horror are now than they did maybe before Get Out. But like, if you go back and look at Rosemary's Baby, you also look at the Stepford Wives, not the Nicole Kidman one, but the 70s one, which is like frame for frame influenced Get Out. That's also a movie that like really teeters between comedy and horror. They're the same. They're kind of the same genre until the last second when you like decide whether you go for the laugh or you go for the scare. And in my case, I'm mostly going for the laugh in a lot of the novel, and then sometimes I go for like a feeling rather than a jump scare.
That is so, I genuinely have never thought about it like that. That is so cool. Stepford Wives is also the same author as Rosemary's Baby. So that's, yeah.
It's a much worse book, unfortunately. It's fine. It'll take you a day to read. They're both like really, really, really short. Rosemary's Baby, the part of the reason it's such a good book is that, I mean, the book and the movie has been out for a long time, so I'm just going to spoil it. There's the way Rosemary gets pregnant with the spawn of Satan is she's assaulted by her husband, who wants to be an actor and has swapped her body for the devil. And all of their neighbors. It's like a horrifying origin story. It is a story about rape, and it's like a second wave feminist novel written by a man. And a huge part of what is radical and revolutionary about the book is the narration follows Rosemary as she justifies her own rape to herself. And then the novel ends with, he has his father's eyes, like the way the movie ends. It ends with, well, I have embraced motherhood. And so it's actually an incredibly radical book that traces the justification of rape culture and patriarchy all the way to the embrace of motherhood. So it's like, how does this woman end up raising the baby she doesn't want with this horrible man? It starts with the institutionalization of patriarchy. It's like a very, very clear line drawn in a really radical way. It's like a much, I think, more nuanced book than people give it credit for being, because so much of it requires that unreliable narration of like, we're in the head of someone who is justifying her own rape to herself, and it is chilling. Yeah. And it's also satire.
Yeah, great book, great movie. Unfortunately, you're right, Roman Polanski. Imagine all of this coming from there. Incredible, though. That movie is also so, it's all set in an apartment. So it has this incredible kind of like defamiliarization of her home, which is one of my favorite things generally across fiction, is just like a woman whose home is becoming kind of like an unsafe space. It's so good.
Yellow wallpaper. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, if anyone has any questions, please go ahead. Otherwise, I have more. So maybe I'll just ask a couple more. And then I think we can let everybody get on with their Friday night. Okay, so this is something I'm generally curious about, which is, you've written 2 novels now and countless short stories. I mean, there's a count, but there are many. But do you find yourself drawn to certain ideas or questions across what you write, or do you see some kind of like through line or themes that you, or even I guess like on a craft level, what is kind of like pushing you to write when you do sit down to write something new?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that, because I think for a lot of people saw this book as sort of a departure from my first one. I don't think it's that much of a departure. I think the voice is pretty consistent. It's like a snarky first-person narrator. But I think the gender switch and the fact that like the first novel is really, it's a work of immigrant fiction. It's very focused on diasporic identity, and it's less about race than it is about gender. So I think some of the like thematic focus has like made it slightly less easy to tag it the same thing online. But so I think there are like some things that hold true in my work. I think my voice is relatively consistent. I think my desire to play with humor and play with like artifice plot and like genre elements is consistent. But I think there's maybe 2 things that are like relatively consistent across what I've written so far and what I think I'll keep writing, which is, first is I'm really interested in the self, like the capital S self. I think that the reason that any of us pick up a novel is because we think that it's interesting to be in someone else's brain. And we think it's possible to know someone else's brain or get to know it a little bit more closely. And so like how we form ourselves is just like the source of perpetual interest to me. And that also explains why I read very widely, right? Like I love a lot of the books that we've just been talking about, which are like these kind of genre-ish or like weirdo takes on the self, whether we're talking about Shirley Jackson or like Julio Cortázar or like Gogol and Kafka, like writers like that. But I also like love Tessa Hadley, this British writer, just like writes these incredibly polite, like very stylistically kind of conservative, lowercase c conservative stories. But she is as deeply interested in the self as Kafka is. And so I find life in her work because of that. Really love the American novelist Dan Shawn, who has written, I think, a lot of really wonderful work about the self and identity from both realist and non-realist perspectives. So the self is of interest to me. And then the other thing that's of interest to me is like the way that social norms form us and also restrict us. Like I think both of my books are about people who they're not like radical bohemians who are completely comfortable like throwing off the chains of conformity. So like they don't like they are kind of on the edge of normalcy and attempting to resist normalcy from inside normalcy, which I think is just how most people are. And so a lot of my work is about conformity, I think, which is like a theme that comes up a lot in like in an immigrant community in the US, but I think is like pretty universal. Yeah.
I wrote down what I thought was the through line that I saw through your novels. And I think it's in between both of those, because I wrote down desire, kind of knowing what you want versus what people are telling you to want, which is it's exactly the two things that you said. So feeling
It's
good
the thing
about
that moves
my own reading skills. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
If anyone has any questions, speak now or forever hold your peace. My last question is just if you want to tell us a few books. You've mentioned a lot so far, but if there's anything recently that you've read or something that you're reading currently that you want to recommend, it's just a fun question.
Yes. Well, the Tessa Hadley book came up, I think, because I just read Free Love, which is her. It's sort of her like Anna Karenina, but set in London in the 60s. And it's like one of the like big questions of Anna Karenina is, you know, can Anna actually leave her husband for Vronsky? Can she strike out on her own? And in the Tessa Hadley book, it takes place at a time when the housewife who cheats on her husband with the younger unsuitable man actually can leave her husband for the unsuitable man. And because it's one of the first times in history that like someone can really, really do that, and not in the way that Anna and Vronsky go off together. And so then it changes. It just sort of changes everything. That's very interesting. I loved that. I loved that book. I was just at a residency and I read so much there. So I'm like trying to choose. I think another book that I didn't mention here, but that was really important in the writing of Goddess Complex is The Horned Man by James Lasdon, which is this like Kafka-esque novel about a man who he's a professor at a school in the, I think it's like, I don't know if it's the 90s or the 2000s, but it's like the kind of pre-Me Too political correctness wave on campus, where and this man thinks of himself as kind of like the good guy among men. And then he realizes that he's maybe being haunted, like literally or figuratively, by a man who was dismissed from his post for sexual harassment. He like thinks this man might be living in his walls of his office. And I think it's like a great Me Too novel, or like, you know, we're going to have another one of these social movements in another generation. It's an incredible novel about gender from the perspective of masculinity and from the perspective of someone who thinks that they're on the right side, but like slips. And it's, I just think it's an incredible, and it's like craft wise, just, I don't know how he pulls off the fever dream that is this novel. And then the last one, and I know you love as well, I think maybe the best book I've read in the last several years is called All Things Cease to Appear by Elizabeth Brundage. It's a murder mystery set in but also like a ghost, like an actual ghost story set in a small town in upstate New York. And Elizabeth Brundage, I think I've read all but one of her books at this point now. She writes about gender with just like chilling brilliant precision, like Du Maurier would be proud. But it's also this novel is like really polyphonic and follows a bunch of different characters who are all kind of swept up in this murder. And like I read this and was like, how did this not win every prize known to man? It's just like on a craft level, it's incredible. It should have been a worldwide bestseller. Like it is so good. What do you tell me why you like that book?
Oh, I like stories set in houses. I think I'm automatically drawn to a woman in a house story, and I actually haven't read it in a really long time, so that's what's stuck in my head right now.
Yeah, totally.
But I should. This is making me. I should reread it, because I remember I read it and immediately loved it. But I also read it during a lockdown, like pandemic lockdown. So it's kind of become part of the time for me. It's just
That
one
is
of the...
quite a book to read during lockdown, because then you're the one in
I
the
think
house.
so. I might be mixing up. It was in some year that has blurred into another year. Yeah, exactly. It really felt like I was kind of like claustrophobic. It's perfect or the worst possible time to read it, one or the other.
I feel
Okay, we have one question from the comments. It's Aarti has sent it in, but she says the question is from UC, which is, you've explored many genres over your first 2 books. What are you exploring in your next book?
Oh, I'm superstitious. I don't talk about my new book in progress. But I am working on some journalism, a couple of screenplays, and I'm working on a new book, but I don't talk about it yet.
Okay, we'll read it when it's out. That's fine. We'll be happy with that. I think that's a good place to end. Thank you so much. This has been so fun.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone watching. You can buy Sanjana's books on our website. Please read them. They're so good.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.